Fort Des Moines, Iowa, December 24, 1944. Snow fell soft against windows of the converted barracks, muffling sound until the world felt wrapped in cotton and silence. 32 German women prisoners sat on wooden benches in the recreation hall, hands folded in laps, faces showing the careful neutrality of people who had learned not to hope for anything beyond survival. Then the door opened. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison entered carrying a small evergreen tree, its branches strung with paper chains and popcorn garlands, its top crowned with a star cut from tin can metal. What happened in the next 3 hours would shatter everything these women had been taught about their enemies. The women had arrived at Fort Des Moines in stages throughout October and November 1944. They were auxiliary personnel, nurses, administrative staff, radio operators captured during the Allied advance through France and Belgium. Not combatants, but military-affiliated civilians who fell under prisoner of war protocols because they had worked for German military operations. Among them was Marguerite Fischer, 31 years old, a former nurse from Hamburg who had tended wounded soldiers in a field hospital overrun by American forces in September. She had expected execution or imprisonment under harsh conditions. Instead, she found herself on a transport ship crossing the Atlantic, then on trains moving through American heartland toward a detention facility in Iowa that looked nothing like the punitive camp's propaganda had described. Fort Des Moines had been a Women's Army Corps training center before being converted to house female prisoners. The facility was basic but adequate wooden barracks with heat, beds with mattresses, mess halls serving regular meals, medical facilities staffed by competent personnel. The conditions contradicted everything the women had been taught to expect from American captivity. But comfort and cruelty could coexist in complicated ways. Physical needs were met, but psychological isolation was profound. The women were far from home, separated from families whose fates they couldn't know, existing in legal limbo where no one could predict when or if they would ever return to Germany. The approaching Christmas season made that displacement more acute. Traditionally a time for family, for home, for certainty about one's place in the world, all things these prisoners had lost. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison supervised the women's section. She was 29, from Cedar Rapids, a former social worker who had joined the Women's Army Corps in 1942. She spoke functional German, enough to give instructions and understand basic responses. She approached her duties with professional competence, but also with recognition that these prisoners were human beings in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. In mid-December, Morrison began thinking about Christmas. The women would spend the holiday in captivity, thousands of miles from home, with no news about families who might be alive or dead in a Germany being bombed to ruins. The regulations said nothing about Christmas celebrations for prisoners. Geneva Conventions required adequate food, shelter, medical care, but said nothing about holidays or emotional well-being beyond minimum physical necessities. Morrison raised the idea with Colonel James Patterson, the camp commander. He was skeptical initially. Christmas celebrations for enemy prisoners seemed inappropriate when American soldiers were dying in Europe. But Morrison argued that allowing basic holiday recognition wasn't reward or special treatment, just acknowledgement of shared humanity during a season traditionally focused on peace and goodwill. Patterson authorized modest Christmas observance with strict parameters. Nothing elaborate, nothing that could be construed as preferential treatment, nothing that would create controversy if reported outside the facility. But a small tree, some decorations, permission for the women to sing carols, these seemed reasonable within bounds of humane detention. Morrison recruited volunteers from among the American personnel. Corporal Helen Walsh, a clerk from Des Moines, helped make paper decorations from available materials. Private Dorothy Chun, whose parents had emigrated from China and understood displacement, strung popcorn into garlands during evening hours. Sergeant William Brady, the facility chaplain, offered to lead a simple interfaith service that would acknowledge the season without requiring anyone to. participate in religious practices they didn't share. The preparations were conducted quietly, without informing the German prisoners. Morrison wasn't sure how they would react. Would they see kindness as manipulation? Would they refuse to participate out of loyalty to their country? Would Christmas observance in captivity feel like mockery of what the holiday was supposed to represent? On December 23rd, Morrison gathered the American personnel involved in the preparation. She explained her concerns. These women have lost everything. Their homes might be destroyed. Their families might be dead. They're prisoners in a foreign country whose language most of them barely speak. Christmas might make all of that worse, might emphasize what they've lost rather than providing comfort. But I think it's worth trying. Because if we can show them that even in captivity, even between enemies, basic human decency persists, that might matter more than we can predict. The group agreed to proceed. The tree was decorated that evening, placed in the recreation hall, chairs arranged in a semicircle facing it. Simple gifts were prepared, small items purchased with personal funds from the American staff. Soap, writing paper, chocolates, handkerchiefs. Nothing expensive, nothing elaborate, just tokens acknowledging each woman as an individual worthy of recognition. December 24th dawned cold and clear, temperature hovering around 15 degrees, snow from previous days, creating a landscape of white punctuated by dark barracks and fence posts. The women followed their normal routine morning roll call, breakfast in the mess hall, work details or recreation periods, according to weekly schedules. At 18 o'clock hours, they were told to report to the recreation hall for a special assembly. No explanation, just the instruction delivered in Morrison's careful German. The women complied with the wary obedience of prisoners, who had learned that unexpected summons could mean anything from routine announcements to transfers to unknown destinations. They filed into the recreation hall, 32 women ranging from 22 to 47 years old, from different regions of Germany, different backgrounds, united only by circumstances of war and capture. They sat on the arranged chairs, silent, watching Morrison and the other American personnel with guarded expressions. Morrison stood at the front of the room, the decorated tree behind her, and began speaking in German. Tonight is Christmas Eve. We know you are far from your homes and families. We know this is a difficult time. We cannot change your circumstances, cannot end the war, cannot reunite you with those you have left behind. But we can acknowledge that Christmas is a time when even enemies might recognize shared humanity. What we offer tonight is modest, but it is offered with genuine intention that you feel, at least for a few hours, some comfort. She gestured to the tree. Several women looked at it, really looked at it for the first time, registering the decorations, the care that had gone into its preparation. Margaret felt something tight in her chest loosening, pressure she hadn't consciously noticed until it began to ease. Chaplain Brady stepped forward. He spoke through Morrison's translation. I will lead a simple service, but participation is voluntary. If you do not wish to join in prayer or singing, you are free to sit quietly. This is not about forcing anyone to celebrate, just offering the opportunity for those who wish it. He began with a reading Luke's nativity story, chosen for its universal recognition across Christian traditions. His voice was gentle, unhurried, reading the familiar words that most of the women had heard since childhood. In Germany, children hid in bunkers during Christmas 1944. Here, they heard the story of peace on earth, read by an American chaplain to German prisoners. The contrast was almost unbearable in its poignancy. After the reading, Brady led the singing of Still Not, Silent Night, the carol written in German, known worldwide, a song that transcended nationality. He started the first verse in English. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright, ... quotes. Then Morrison began the second verse in German. Still not. Heilig Nacht, Eils Schlad, Einsam WACHT ... For a moment, the German women sat frozen, uncertain whether they should join. Then one voice added to Morrison's Marguerite, singing quietly, the words automatic from childhood repetition. Another voice joined, then another, until all 32 women were singing, their voices blending with the Americans, the language switching between verses, the melody carrying emotions that words alone couldn't express. By the third verse, tears were streaming down multiple faces, German and American both. The Americans cried because the moment was more powerful than they had anticipated, the human connection across enemy lines almost overwhelming. The Germans cried because they hadn't expected kindness, hadn't dared to hope that Christmas could still mean something beyond loss and displacement. When the carol ended, silence held for a long moment. No one moved. The weight of what had just happened pressed on everyone present a recognition that despite war, despite nationalism, despite propaganda insisting they were fundamentally different, they were all just people who knew the same songs, felt the same. Emotions carried the same capacity for grief and joy. Morrison broke the silence gently. We have small gifts. Nothing significant, just tokens. Each of you will receive a package. The American personnel distributed wrapped parcels, one to each prisoner. The women opened them with careful movements, revealing the simple contents soap that smelled of lavender writing paper with envelopes. A chocolate bar, a handkerchief embroidered with the letter M. Morrison had bought a dozen, distributing them regardless of whether the initial matched each woman's name, a small imperfection that somehow made the gesture more genuine. Marguerite held her package, looking at the contents, feeling something breaking inside her. She had expected to spend Christmas in misery, marking another loss in a year of losses. Instead, she was holding gifts from Americans who had spent their own money to provide small comforts to enemy prisoners. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. After the gift distribution, Morrison invited the women to share their own Christmas traditions. The invitation was tentative. She wasn't sure whether they would want to speak, whether sharing would feel painful or comforting. Anna Weber, a former administrative clerk from Munich, spoke first. In halting English, "In my home, we make stollen, Christmas bread with fruit. My mother, she bakes 6, gives to neighbors. The smell fills our house. I can remember this smell even now." She stopped, emotion overwhelming her. Another woman, Helga Schmidt from Berlin, continued. "We sing carols on Christmas Eve, then go to midnight mass. My father plays piano, old songs, traditional songs. He is not musical man, but at Christmas he plays." The sharing continued, each woman contributing a memory, a tradition, a fragment of what Christmas had meant before the war consumed everything. The Americans listened without interrupting, bearing witness to stories that made these prisoners into individuals with families, childhoods, normal lives disrupted by circumstances none of them had chosen. Then Morrison did something unexpected. She asked Corporal Walsh to bring in items that had been prepared, but not revealed. Walsh returned carrying a tray of stolen Christmas bread that Morrison had learned to make from a German cookbook, spending 2 evenings in the camp kitchen preparing the traditional treat. The stolen was imperfect Morrison's first attempt at the recipe, the texture not quite right, the fruit distribution uneven, but the effort was unmistakable. She had taken time to learn something from their culture, to recreate a taste of home, to show that their traditions mattered enough to honor, even in captivity. Anna began crying when she saw the stolen. Not quiet tears, but sobs that shook her entire body, weeks of suppressed emotion pouring out at the sight of bread that represented everything she had lost. Other women joined her, the room filling with the sound of grief mixed with gratitude, the complex emotional release that comes when unexpected kindness breaks through carefully maintained defenses. Morrison hadn't anticipated this intensity of response. She felt overwhelmed herself, questioning whether the Christmas celebration had been cruel rather than kind, whether it had simply emphasized loss rather than providing comfort. But Chaplain Brady touched her arm gently, shook his head. This release was necessary. This emotion needed outlet. The crying gradually subsided. The women ate the stolen despite its imperfections, savoring the taste that connected them to homes they might never see again. They drank coffee that the Americans had brewed, strong and hot, cutting through the cold that seemed to live inside them regardless of room temperature. Marguerite approached Morrison during this quieter phase. In careful English, "Why you do this? We are enemy. Your soldiers. They die fighting our soldiers. Why you give us Christmas?" Morrison had been thinking about this question for weeks, anticipating it, trying to formulate an answer that was honest without being trite. She responded, "Because Christmas is supposed to be about peace on earth, goodwill toward all people. Not goodwill only toward friends or allies, but toward all people. You didn't start this war. You're nurses and clerks and operators who happened to be in places when armies moved. You deserve basic human dignity regardless of nationality. This celebration doesn't make us allies or friends necessarily, but it acknowledges that we human beings who have lost much and deserve recognition of that loss." Marguerite absorbed this slowly. Then she said something Morrison would remember for the rest of her life. "We were taught that Americans have no culture, no depth, only materialism. But what you have shown tonight requires cultural sophistication and moral depth that contradicts everything we were taught." "I do not know how to reconcile this." Morrison nodded. "Maybe you're not supposed to reconcile it. Maybe you're just supposed to remember it when the war ends and you go home. Remember that propaganda was false, that enemies can recognize each other's humanity, that your understanding of Americans was deliberately distorted." The evening continued with more singing German carols, American carols, even attempts at French carols by women who had learned them in school. The repertoire was mixed, the pronunciation often incorrect, but the spirit was genuine. Music became the language that transcended barriers of nationality and enmity. By 22 o'clock hours, the gathering was ending. The women returned to their barracks, carrying their small gifts, the taste of stolen still in their mouths, the sound of carols still in their ears. They lay in their beds that night, processing what had happened, trying to understand how Christmas in captivity could somehow have felt more genuine than any recent Christmas in their homeland. The Christmas celebration created ripples that extended far beyond that single evening. Over the following weeks, the dynamic between guards and prisoners shifted subtly. The women spoke more openly with American personnel, asked questions about American life, shared more details about their own backgrounds. The rigid prisoner-guard relationship softened into something more complex, not friendship, exactly, but recognition of mutual humanity that made simple interactions more human. Marguerite began keeping a detailed journal. She wrote in German, knowing American authorities might read it, but compelled to document her experiences with honesty, despite that surveillance. Her entry from December 25, 1944, read, "Yesterday was Christmas Eve. I expected misery. Instead, I experienced kindness that has shaken my entire understanding of this war. The Americans prepared a celebration for us, a tree, gifts, traditional foods, carols sung together. They did this without obligation, without benefit to themselves, simply because they believed we deserved recognition of the holiday despite being prisoners. I cried harder last night than I have cried since my capture, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming shock of discovering that everything I was taught about Americans is false. They are not culturally inferior. They are not cruel. They are not incapable of sophisticated moral thinking. If my leaders lied to me about this, what else have they lied about? The question is terrifying, but I cannot avoid asking it." Other women wrote letters home through Red Cross channels, carefully worded to pass censorship, but attempting to convey the unexpected nature of their treatment. Anna wrote to her mother, "We celebrated Christmas in the American facility. I cannot provide details, but know that I am being treated with more dignity than I expected. The Americans are not the monsters we were told to fear. I hope you are safe. I hope our home still stands. I dream of the day we can bake stolen together again. The letters took weeks to reach Germany, if they reached it at all. Many were lost in the chaos of the war's final months. But some arrived, or read by families trying to understand what was happening to their daughters and sisters, created small challenges to propaganda narratives that insisted American captivity meant degradation and suffering. Lieutenant Morrison received recognition for the Christmas program from Colonel Patterson. He had been skeptical initially, but couldn't deny the positive impact prisoner morale improved. Cooperation increased. The facility ran more smoothly when prisoners and guards saw each other as human beings rather than abstract enemies. But more significantly for Morrison personally, the experience changed her understanding of her role. She had entered military service, believing in American exceptionalism, in the righteousness of the war effort, in clear distinctions between allies and enemies. The Christmas celebration complicated those certainties. She had created genuine human connection with women who were technically enemies, discovered that they were neither monsters nor ideological fanatics, but ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. She wrote in her personal journal, "I organized a Christmas celebration thinking I was offering charity to unfortunate prisoners. What I discovered was that these women are my contemporaries, nurses, clerks, professionals whose lives were disrupted by war they didn't start or necessarily support. They missed their families, fear for loved ones, hope for peace. They are, in every meaningful way, except nationality, indistinguishable from the American women I work with. This recognition is both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it confirms shared humanity. Disturbing because it makes the war feel less morally clear, less about good versus evil, and more about competing nationalisms that sacrifice ordinary people for abstract political goals." As January became February, and the war ground toward its conclusion, the bonds formed during that Christmas celebration deepened. The women helped teach German to American personnel interested in learning. They shared recipes, cultural knowledge, folk songs, gradually becoming resources rather than simply detainees. The transformation wasn't universal. Some women remained distant. Some American guards remained suspicious, but enough people on both sides changed their perspectives to create a different atmosphere in the facility. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the women at Fort Des Moines faced uncertain futures. Repatriation was complicated by Germany's total collapse, by questions about what they would return to, by logistical challenges of moving millions of displaced people. They remained at the facility through summer 1945, their status shifting from prisoners of war to displaced persons awaiting transport home. During those months, the relationships formed during Christmas 1944 evolved further. Marguerite and Morrison had multiple long conversations about the war, about propaganda, about how to rebuild after such comprehensive destruction. Morrison found herself serving as informal counselor, helping German women process trauma, loss, uncertainty about futures that seemed impossible to predict. Marguerite returned to Germany in October 1945. Hamburg, her home city, was in ruins, 90% destroyed by bombing. Population depleted, infrastructure collapsed. She found work as a nurse in a makeshift hospital treating disease and malnutrition among survivors, trying to rebuild some version of normal life from fragments. But she carried the memory of that Christmas 1944 with her, a touchstone for understanding that Americans weren't the enemies propaganda had described. That memory influenced how she engaged with occupation forces, how she taught younger Germans about the war, how she processed her own nation's responsibility for the catastrophe. In 1947, she wrote a letter to Morrison through American military mail services. The letter was long, detailed, describing her return to Hamburg, her work, her slow processing of what Germany had become. But the core message was simpler. Dear Lieutenant Morrison, I think often of Christmas Eve 1944 at Fort Des Moines. At the time, I could not fully appreciate what you had done, giving prisoners a celebration, recognizing our humanity, showing kindness without expectation of return. Now, 2 years later, Living in ruins of my city, I understand more completely. You demonstrated that even in war, even between enemies, human decency can persist. That memory sustains me through difficult present. I teach younger people about the war, and I always mention Christmas in Iowa, American lieutenant who organized celebration for German prisoners. Some people don't believe the story. They cannot imagine enemies treating each other with such humanity. But I know it happened because I lived it. Thank you for teaching me that propaganda lies, that Americans are as capable of goodness as any people, that the war was fought between governments, not between fundamentally different kinds of humans. Morrison kept that letter for the rest of her life. She returned to Cedar Rapids after the war, resumed social work, married, raised 3 children, lived an ordinary American post-war life. But the Christmas 1944 celebration remained one of her defining memories, the moment when she learned that the line between enemy and friend was more permeable than propaganda suggested. She corresponded with Marguerite periodically over decades. The letters were infrequent once or twice a year, but sustained a connection forged in unlikely circumstances. They shared updates about families, about careers, about their respective nations' transformations from wartime enemies to Cold War allies. In 1974, Marguerite visited the United States for the first time since her repatriation. She traveled to Iowa specifically to see Morrison, to visit Fort Des Moines, to stand in the recreation hall where that Christmas celebration had occurred 30 years earlier. The facility had been repurposed, no longer housing prisoners, but the room was recognizable, same dimensions, same windows, though everything else had changed. They were both in their 60s then, gray-haired, carrying decades of accumulated experience. They hugged with the easy familiarity of old friends, despite having spent only months together 30 years prior. Morrison's children, grown with families of their own, joined them for dinner, listening to stories about Christmas 1944, trying to understand how their mother and this German woman had formed such lasting connection. Marguerite's daughter Anna, named for the woman who had cried over Stolen, was present too. She was 28, a teacher in Hamburg, representing a generation born after the war. She listened to her mother's stories with attention that mixed respect with incomprehension. Her mother's wartime experiences seemed impossibly distant, from a world she could barely imagine. Before returning to Germany, Marguerite gave Morrison a gift, a piece of Stolen, homemade, wrapped carefully for travel. "My mother's recipe," Marguerite said, "the one I remembered that Christmas night. I have made it every year since returning home. This year's batch is for you." Morrison accepted the gift with tears in her eyes. Understanding the symbolism, this wasn't just bread. It was continuity, connection across 30 years, acknowledgement that what had started with imperfect American-made Stolen in 1944 had resulted in genuine friendship sustained across decades. When German women POWs experienced their first Christmas in America on December 24, 1944, at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, they expected nothing beyond the minimum necessities of detention. Christmas as prisoners seemed destined to be a day marking loss rather than celebrating anything worth recognizing. What they received instead was unexpected kindness, celebration organized not because regulations required it, but because human beings decided these prisoners deserved recognition of the holiday, deserved acknowledgement of their displacement and grief, deserved to feel, at least for a few hours, some connection to traditions that linked them to better times. The tears shed that evening were complex grief for what was lost, gratitude for unexpected kindness, confusion about how enemies could show such humanity, relief at discovering that propaganda had been false. All of these emotions mixed together in crying that represented psychological release, the breaking down of defenses built to survive captivity. But those tears also represented something else, the moment when propaganda collided with reality so forcefully that the propaganda could unsurvive intact. The women had been taught that Americans were culturally inferior, morally bankrupt, incapable of sophisticated human feeling. Then they received a Christmas celebration that demonstrated cultural awareness, moral consideration, and genuine human empathy. The contradiction couldn't be explained away or dismissed as aberration. It required fundamental reevaluation of everything they had been taught. That reevaluation had lasting consequences. The women who experienced that Christmas carried the memory back to Germany, where it influenced how they understood the occupation, how they taught younger generations about the war, how they processed their nation's responsibility for catastrophe. They became witnesses to the possibility of humanity across enemy lines, testimonies that challenged simplified narratives about good versus evil, us versus them. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison's decision to organize the celebration wasn't heroic in any conventional sense. She didn't save lives in immediate physical danger or demonstrate exceptional courage under fire. She simply recognized that prisoners far from home during Christmas deserved some acknowledgement of the holiday, and she acted on that recognition despite no regulation requiring it. But that simple recognition translated into action through decorated tree and paper gifts and homemade stollen, created effects that rippled through decades. 32 German women learned that Americans weren't monsters. They carried that knowledge home, taught it to families and students, passed it forward to generations who would rebuild German-American relations from the ruins of war. The friendship between Morrison and Marguerite, sustained across 30 years and an ocean, demonstrated that connections formed in unlikely circumstances can endure through time. The stolen Marguerite, brought Morrison in 1974, represented the inheritance of kindness, how a simple act compounds through time, creating traditions that persist, relationships that endure, understandings that shape how people engage with former enemies. Morrison's imperfect American-made stollen in 1944 had led to Marguerite's perfect German-made stollen 30 years later, the recipe preserved, and passed down because the gesture that inspired it had mattered so profoundly. When those German women shed tears of joy on Christmas Eve 1944, they were mourning loss while discovering unexpected grace. They were prisoners experiencing humanity from captors. They were enemies learning that enemies could still recognize each other as human beings deserving of dignity and compassion. Those tears watered seeds of reconciliation that would grow slowly through post-war decades, contributing to transformation of German-American relations from enmity to alliance. The transformation had many causes: political decisions, economic necessities, strategic calculations. But it was also built on accumulated individual moments, when people chose humanity over hostility, when they recognized that even enemies share fundamental human experiences, when they created memories of kindness that would persist long after wars ended. A Christmas tree in a prison camp, paper gifts wrapped carefully, carols sung together across language barriers, stollen baked imperfectly, but received with overwhelming gratitude. These simple things changed lives, challenged propaganda, planted seeds of understanding that would bear fruit for generations. The tears of joy were real, and they mattered.